On the night of June 4, 1942, as the sun set over the Central Pacific, Admiral Raymond Spruance stood on the bridge of the USS Enterprise and made a decision that would haunt him for decades. Behind him, somewhere to the west, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers burned or sank beneath the waves. His dive bombers had just achieved one of the most devastating aerial attacks in naval history, transforming the course of the Pacific War in 5 explosive minutes. His staff urged him to pursue. Every instinct of naval warfare demanded he hunt down the fleeing enemy. The Japanese were wounded, disorganized, retreating in chaos. This was the moment to deliver the killing blow. Spruance looked at the darkening horizon and ordered his ships to turn east, toward Hawaii, away from the enemy. 300 miles to the west, aboard the largest battleship ever built, Admiral Yamamoto sat in his operations room and waited for Spruance to make exactly that mistake. The commander of the Japanese combined fleet had just lost 4 irreplaceable aircraft carriers, but he still commanded the most powerful surface fleet in the Pacific. 7 battleships, including his flagship Yamato with its 18-inch guns, 11 cruisers, and dozens of destroyers, surged through the darkness toward the spot where he calculated the American carriers would be by midnight. If Spruance had pursued his retreating carriers, he would have sailed directly into Yamamoto's trap. Spruance never knew exactly what waited for him in that darkness. He only knew that something was wrong, that pursuing a beaten enemy at night felt like walking into an ambush. He trusted that instinct over the advice of his staff, over the expectations of his superiors, over everything he had been taught about aggressive naval warfare. His decision to turn away would be called cowardice by some, brilliance by others. The truth would not become clear until after the war, when captured Japanese documents revealed just how close the Americans came to disaster. To understand why Spruance made his decision, we must first understand the man himself. Raymond Ames Spruance was born in Baltimore, Maryland on July 3, 1886, the son of a reclusive father. He was raised largely by his mother and 3 aunts, developing an introspective nature that would define his command style. As a young man, he showed an unexpected talent for poetry. The future admiral, who would command thousands of men in combat, once filled notebooks with verse. Spruance graduated from the Naval Academy at Annapolis in 1906 and spent his early career in battleships and destroyers. He circumnavigated the globe with the Great White Fleet, Theodore Roosevelt's show of American naval power. He studied electrical engineering. He commanded a destroyer in the Philippines before the First World War. Throughout these assignments, he developed a reputation for quiet competence, for thinking problems through carefully before acting, for keeping a calm bridge where orders were given concisely and without unnecessary drama. His fellow officers noticed something else about Spruance. He had no interest in publicity. While other ambitious officers cultivated relationships with journalists and politicians, Spruance shunned attention. He believed that a commander's judgment was best when he could forget himself and any reputation he had acquired, concentrating wholly on making the right decision. This philosophy would shape his approach to command throughout his career. Between the wars, Spruance served 3 tours at the Naval War College, first as a student and then twice as an instructor. He absorbed the principles of naval strategy that had been developed over centuries, principles that emphasized the preservation of one's own forces, the achievement of strategic objectives, and the avoidance of unnecessary risk. These were not lessons in timidity. They were lessons in wisdom, in understanding that battles were not won by sinking ships, but by achieving goals. By the spring of 1942, the strategic situation in the Pacific had reached a critical inflection point. Japan had achieved 6 months of unbroken victory. the Rising Sun flag flew over Hong Kong, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, the Philippines, Burma, and countless Pacific islands. The British Empire in Asia had collapsed in humiliating defeat. The American Asiatic fleet had been annihilated. From the Aleutian Islands to the Indian Ocean, Japanese forces seemed invincible. But beneath the surface of these triumphs, serious problems were developing. Japanese shipping losses to American submarines were mounting. The perimeter Japan had conquered was too large to defend adequately. And most ominously, American industrial production was beginning to accelerate. Every week brought reports of new ships laid down in American yards, new aircraft rolling off assembly lines, new divisions forming in training camps across the United States. The Battle of Midway began as a Japanese gamble, born of desperation disguised as confidence. In the 6 months since Pearl Harbor, Admiral Yamamoto had watched American industrial power begin to stir. He understood in ways many of his colleagues did not, that Japan could not win a prolonged war against the United States. The only path to victory lay in destroying the American Pacific Fleet so completely that Washington would sue for peace before its factories could bury Japan under an avalanche of ships and aircraft. Yamamoto had studied in America. He had attended Harvard University and served as a naval attaché in Washington. He knew American capabilities in ways that most Japanese officers did not. He had reportedly warned his superiors that Japan could run wild for 6 months to a year after Pearl Harbor. But he had no confidence in the second or third year. The window for Japanese victory was closing with every passing week. Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of coral 1,200 miles northwest of Hawaii, was the bait. Yamamoto knew the Americans would fight to defend it. The atoll sat at the extreme edge of the Hawaiian island chain, and its capture would give Japan a forward base from which to threaten Hawaii itself. More importantly, defending Midway would force the American carriers out of Pearl Harbor and into a battle Yamamoto intended to win with overwhelming force. The plan was characteristically complex. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo would lead the first carrier striking force, the Kido Butai, consisting of the same 4 fleet carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu represented the most experienced and powerful carrier force in the world. Their pilots had swept across the Pacific for 6 months without defeat, destroying the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, sinking the British capital ships Prince of Wales and Repulse off Malaya, raiding the Indian Ocean and bombing Darwin in Australia. Nagumo would neutralize Midway's defenses with airstrikes. Once the American carriers responded, Nagumo would destroy them. Behind Nagumo, trailing several hundred miles to the rear, Yamamoto would bring up the main body, his massive battleship force. The super battleship Yamato, commissioned just 6 months earlier and still so secret that most Americans did not know it existed, would lead 7 battleships toward the battle area. If any American ships survived Nagumo's carriers, they would be crushed between the retreating carrier force and the advancing battleships. The Japanese plan contained one fatal assumption. Yamamoto believed the Americans would not know he was coming until his aircraft appeared over Midway. He was catastrophically wrong. In a cramped basement office at Pearl Harbor, a team of naval intelligence officers had been working around the clock to break the Japanese naval code, known as JN-25. The unit was called Station Hypo, and its commander was a disheveled, workaholic cryptanalyst named Joseph Rochefort. His team worked in conditions that would have horrified any inspector, surrounded by piles of paper and unwashed coffee cups, sleeping on cots when they slept at all. By late May, Rochefort's team had pieced together enough fragments to know that a major Japanese operation was planned against a target designated AF. The cryptanalysts suspected AF was Midway, but they needed confirmation. Rochefort devised a simple test. He arranged for Midway to transmit an unencrypted radio message reporting that its water distillation plant had broken down. Days later, Japanese radio traffic reported that AF was short of fresh water. The trap was confirmed. The intelligence coup was extraordinary. For the first time in the Pacific War, the Americans knew approximately when the Japanese would attack, where they would attack, and with what forces. But knowledge alone did not guarantee victory. The Americans still faced a numerically superior enemy, commanded by the most successful naval force in modern history. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet from Pearl Harbor, now faced an agonizing decision. He knew the Japanese were coming. He knew he was outnumbered. Against Yamamoto's 4 fleet carriers, Nimitz could field only 3. Against Yamamoto's 11 battleships, Nimitz had none available for the battle. The Japanese force included over 200 ships. Nimitz could scrape together 26. But Nimitz also understood something the Japanese did not. He could position his carriers northeast of Midway before the Japanese arrived, hidden beyond the range of enemy reconnaissance. He designated the ambush position Point Luck. Instead of reacting to a Japanese attack, he could ambush the ambushers. Nimitz gave his commanders a letter of instruction containing the most important guidance of the battle. "You will be governed by the principle of calculated risk," Nimitz wrote, "which you shall interpret to mean the avoidance of exposure of your force to attack by superior enemy forces without good prospect of inflicting, as a result of such exposure, greater damage to the enemy." The message was clear. Win the battle if possible, but do not lose the fleet. The carriers Spruance and Fletcher commanded represented 3/4 of America's carrier strength in the Pacific. If they were lost, Hawaii would be defenseless. The war in the Pacific could be lost in an afternoon. The execution of this plan required a commander who could think clearly under pressure, who would not be rattled by the chaos of carrier warfare, and who would follow Nimitz's instructions precisely. Nimitz's first choice was Vice Admiral William Halsey, the aggressive, flamboyant carrier commander who had led the Doolittle raid against Tokyo in April. But 2 days before the fleet was scheduled to sail, Halsey was hospitalized with a severe skin condition that left him barely able to function. The timing could not have been worse. Nimitz was counting on Halsey's experience and aggression. The admiral who had led daring raids against Japanese bases in the Marshall Islands, who had escorted the Doolittle bombers within striking range of Tokyo, was the obvious choice to command the most important naval engagement of the war. Now Nimitz had to find a replacement with less than 48 hours before the fleet sailed. From his hospital bed, Halsey made a recommendation that surprised many in the fleet. He suggested his cruiser commander, Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, as his replacement. Meanwhile, the repair of the Yorktown was proceeding at a pace that defied belief. The carrier had limped back to Pearl Harbor after the Battle of the Coral Sea in May, her hull pierced by bombs, her internal compartments flooded. Navy Yard engineers estimated she would need 90 days in dry dock for proper repairs. Nimitz told them they had 3 days. Over 1,400 workers swarmed aboard the damaged carrier. They worked around the clock, welding patches over bomb holes, shoring up damaged bulkheads, replacing destroyed equipment with whatever could be found. Sailors from other ships volunteered to help. The work continued through the night under floodlights, creating a glow that could be seen for miles. On the morning of May 30, 1942, less than 72 hours after entering dry dock, Yorktown backed out of Pearl Harbor and headed for Point Luck. She was not fully repaired, but she could launch and recover aircraft. That would have to be enough. The choice seemed unlikely. Spruance was not an aviator. He had spent his career commanding surface ships, Most recently, the 4 heavy cruisers that screened Halsey's carriers during the early raids against Japanese positions. He had never commanded carriers in combat. He had never directed an airstrike. He would be commanding aviators who might resent taking orders from a surface officer. But Halsey knew Spruance in ways that others did not. The two men had served together for 6 months, and Halsey had watched Spruance operate under stress. Where Halsey was impulsive and emotional, Spruance was calm and analytical. Where Halsey sought glory, Spruance sought results. Halsey told Nimitz that Spruance had the brains and the temperament to handle the most important naval battle of the war. The two admirals were a study in contrasts. Halsey was aggressive, vulgar, beloved by his sailors, and constantly quoted in newspapers. Spruance was reserved, intellectual, preferred by senior officers, and virtually unknown to the public. Captain George Dyer, who would serve under both men, captured the difference precisely. "My feeling was one of confidence when Spruance was there," Dyer recalled. When you moved into Admiral Spruance's command from Admiral Halsey's, you moved from an area in which you never knew what you were going to do in the next 5 minutes, to one where the printed instructions were up to date and you did things in accordance with them. Nimitz agreed with Halsey's recommendation. He gave Spruance command of Task Force 16, built around the carriers Enterprise and Hornet. Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher would command Task Force 17, centered on the carrier Yorktown, and would serve as overall tactical commander. But because Spruance commanded the larger force, and because Yorktown had been badly damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea a month earlier, everyone understood that Spruance would likely bear the heaviest burden. The morning of June 4, 1942, began with the Japanese launching 108 aircraft against Midway Island. Nagumo expected to find the American carriers still in Pearl Harbor, days away from intervening. He did not know they were waiting barely 200 miles to his northeast, positioned exactly where Rochefort's intelligence had predicted the Japanese would appear. American reconnaissance aircraft spotted the Japanese carriers shortly after dawn. Spruance faced his first critical decision. Standard doctrine called for closing the distance before launching an attack to maximize the chances of his aircraft returning safely. But closing the distance would take time, and time was the enemy. Every hour that passed increased the risk that Japanese scout planes would find his carriers. Spruance consulted with Captain Miles Browning, his chief of staff, and an experienced aviator who had served under Halsey. Browning recommended an immediate launch at maximum range. Spruance agreed. His aircraft would strike while the Japanese were preoccupied with the Midway attack, catching them at their most vulnerable. It was a calculated gamble. Many of his pilots would run out of fuel before returning. Some would be lost simply because the distance was too great. But the alternative, waiting for a better opportunity that might never come, was worse. The American strike was a disaster in execution, but a triumph in outcome. The air groups from 3 carriers launched in confusion, with torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters failing to rendezvous as planned. The torpedo squadrons found the Japanese first, attacking without fighter escort because their Wildcat fighters had become separated during the long flight. What happened next was one of the most heroic and tragic episodes in American naval history. 41 torpedo bombers from 3 squadrons pressed their attacks against the Japanese carriers. They flew Douglas TBD Devastators, obsolete aircraft that were too slow, too poorly armed, and too vulnerable to survive against modern fighters and anti-aircraft defenses. 35 were shot down. Not a single torpedo hit its target. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet directly at the Japanese carriers. Waldron was 39 years old, a veteran naval aviator who had grown up in South Dakota with Sioux heritage. He knew exactly what he was asking his men to do. Before launching, he had addressed his pilots in their ready room. "If there is only one plane left to make a final run in," he told them, "I want that man to go in and get a hit." Waldron led his 15 aircraft toward the Japanese carriers without hesitation. 0 fighters swarmed around them. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky. One by one, the devastators were shot down. Waldron's aircraft was among the first to fall. All 15 planes were destroyed. 29 men died. Only one man, Ensign George Gay, survived. Floating in the water amid the wreckage of his squadron, hiding under a seat cushion to avoid being strafed. Torpedo Squadrons 6 and 3 from Enterprise and Yorktown suffered similar fates. Their attacks were equally brave and equally futile. Commander Eugene Lindsay of Torpedo 6 was killed leading his squadron. Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey of Torpedo 3 died with most of his men. Of 41 torpedo bombers launched against the Japanese carriers, only 6 returned. But the sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons achieved something their commanders never anticipated. To defend against the low-flying torpedo bombers, Japanese Zero fighters had descended to sea level. Japanese anti-aircraft gunners had focused their attention on the waves. The Japanese combat air patrol was out of position. For a few crucial minutes, the sky above the carriers was empty. At 10:20 in the morning, dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown arrived over the Japanese fleet. They had become lost during the long flight, navigated by instinct and luck to the enemy position, and now found themselves looking down at 4 aircraft carriers with their decks crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed. The Japanese had no warning. The Zeros were too low to intercept. The anti-aircraft crews were looking the wrong way. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led the dive bombers from Enterprise. He had been searching for the Japanese fleet for over an hour, his fuel gauges dropping toward empty, when he spotted a lone Japanese destroyer racing northeast. McCluskey reasoned that the destroyer must be heading toward the carriers and turned to follow its wake. The decision saved the American attack and possibly the battle. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie led the dive bombers from Yorktown. His aircraft had accidentally released their bombs during the flight out, but Leslie pressed the attack anyway, diving on the enemy carriers to draw anti-aircraft fire, while his wingmen dropped their bombs. In 5 minutes of diving, screaming attacks, they transformed 3 Japanese fleet carriers into burning wrecks. Akagi, the flagship of the Kido Butai, took 1 bomb that penetrated to her hangar deck and detonated among armed and fueled aircraft. Avgas erupted in sheets of flame. Torpedoes cooked off in their racks. Secondary explosions ripped through the ship. Admiral Nagumo was forced to transfer his flag to a cruiser as Akagi became an inferno. Kaga took at least 4 direct hits and was soon ablaze from bow to stern. Her captain was killed almost immediately. Damage control teams fought desperately to contain the fires, but with aviation fuel feeding the flames and ammunition exploding throughout the ship, their efforts were hopeless. Soryu took 3 bombs and was burning uncontrollably within minutes. Captain Ryosaku Yanagimoto refused to leave his bridge as the flames closed in around him. Sailors attempting to rescue him were driven back by the heat. Yanagimoto died at his post, singing the Japanese national anthem as his ship burned. In those 5 catastrophic minutes, the balance of power in the Pacific shifted permanently. The 4 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor, that had swept across Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean without defeat, were reduced to burning hulks. Japanese naval aviation would never recover. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, escaped the initial attack and launched a counterstrike that found and badly damaged Yorktown. But later that afternoon, American dive bombers found Hiryu and left her burning as well. By nightfall, all 4 Japanese carriers were sinking or abandoned. The the greatest carrier force in the world, had been destroyed in a single day. Spruance had achieved a victory beyond anything Nimitz had dared hope. Over 200 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed. More than 3,000 Japanese sailors and airmen were dead, including many of the most experienced pilots in the Imperial Navy. The question now was what to do next. His staff urged pursuit. The Japanese surface fleet was retreating westward, wounded and demoralized. Japanese cruisers and destroyers that had been screening the carriers were still out there somewhere. Night was falling, but aggressive pursuit might catch the enemy disorganized and destroy even more ships. Captain Browning was particularly insistent. This was the moment to press the attack, to turn a great victory into a total one. Every naval tradition demanded pursuit of a beaten enemy. Spruance listened to his staff and then made his decision. He would not pursue. Instead, he ordered Task Force 16 to turn east toward Midway, to ensure that any remaining Japanese forces could not threaten the island during the night. He would refuel his destroyers, recover his aircraft, and resume the search for the enemy in daylight. The decision was immediately controversial. Some of his officers believed Spruance was throwing away a chance to annihilate the Japanese fleet. Critics would later argue that a more aggressive commander, someone like Halsey, would have pursued and destroyed ships that Spruance allowed to escape, but Spruance understood something his critics ignored. Pursuit at night meant a surface engagement, and surface engagements at night favored the Japanese in ways that most American officers did not fully comprehend. The Imperial Japanese Navy had spent the previous decade perfecting night combat tactics. Since the 1920s, Japanese naval doctrine had emphasized the decisive battle, a climactic engagement that would destroy the enemy fleet in a single action. Japanese planners knew they could not match American industrial capacity in a prolonged war. Their strategy depended on winning quickly and decisively. Night fighting offered a way to offset American advantages. In darkness, American superiority in numbers and gunfire could be neutralized. Japanese torpedo tactics, perfected through years of relentless training, could devastate enemy formations before they could respond. The Imperial Navy invested enormous resources in developing these capabilities. The centerpiece of Japanese night fighting capability was the Type 93 torpedo. American sailors would later call it the Long Lance, and it was unlike anything in Western arsenals. The Type 93 used pure oxygen as fuel instead of compressed air, giving it a range of over 20 miles at high speed and more than 24 miles at reduced speed. Its warhead carried over 1,000 pounds of explosives, 50% more than American torpedoes. Most importantly, it left almost no visible wake, making it nearly impossible to detect until it struck. Japanese destroyers and cruisers could fire salvos of these torpedoes at ranges beyond American gun range, then withdraw before the enemy knew they were under attack. Japanese lookouts, trained to spot targets at night using powerful binoculars, consistently detected American ships before American radar could find them. The primitive radar of 1942 was unreliable and poorly understood by inexperienced operators. The results of Japanese night fighting excellence would become horrifically apparent in the Guadalcanal campaign later that year. At the Battle of Savo Island on August 9, 1942, a Japanese cruiser force under Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa annihilated 4 Allied heavy cruisers in less than an hour. The American cruisers, Astoria, Quincy, and Vincennes, and the Australian cruiser Canberra were sunk or fatally damaged. Japanese losses were negligible. American radar had detected the approaching Japanese force, but operators failed to identify it as hostile until too late. At the Battle of Tassafaronga on November 30, 1942, 8 Japanese destroyers engaged 5 American heavy cruisers and 4 destroyers. The American force had radar. The American force opened fire first. The Japanese responded with a torpedo salvo that sank the cruiser Northampton and crippled 3 others. Only 1 Japanese destroyer was lost. The long-lance torpedoes had done exactly what they were designed to do. Spruance had no way of knowing specifically what waited for him in the darkness west of Midway on the night of June 4. The existence of the long-lance torpedo was not yet known to American intelligence. The full extent of Japanese night fighting capabilities had not been demonstrated, but Spruance sensed the danger. He understood that his cruisers and destroyers, untrained in night combat and equipped with inferior torpedoes, would be at a severe disadvantage against Japanese surface forces. Most importantly, he remembered Nimitz's instruction about calculated risk. His mission was to protect Midway and preserve the fleet, not to destroy every Japanese ship in the ocean. He had already accomplished far more than anyone expected. Risking that victory for the chance to sink a few more ships was not calculated risk. It was gambling. What Spruance did not know, and could not know, was that his caution had saved his task force from catastrophe. When reports of the carrier disaster reached Yamamoto aboard Yamato, the Japanese commander refused to accept defeat. He still had 7 battleships, including the mightiest warship in the world. Yamato displaced over 70,000 tons and carried 9 18-inch guns, the largest ever mounted on a warship. He still had cruisers and destroyers. If he could bring the American carriers to a night surface engagement, he might yet snatch victory from the disaster that Nagumo had created. Yamamoto ordered his main body to surge forward at maximum speed. He directed Vice Admiral Nobutaka Kondo to bring his fast battleships east to support the effort. He calculated that if the Americans pursued their retreating carriers as any aggressive commander would, they would sail directly into his guns. The Japanese battleships pressed through the darkness, hunting for an enemy who was not there. Spruance had turned away. His carriers were steaming east, opening the distance between themselves and Yamamoto's trap. By midnight, it was clear to Yamamoto that the Americans were not coming. The realization was devastating. Yamamoto had gambled everything on this operation. He had concentrated the greatest naval force in Japanese history for a battle that would decide the war. Now his carriers were gone and his battleships had found nothing to fight. He retired to his cabin aboard Yamato and refused to see anyone for 3 days. When a subordinate asked who would apologize to the emperor for the defeat, Yamamoto replied that he alone would bear that responsibility. The vindication of Spruance's decision did not come immediately. In the weeks after Midway, some critics questioned why he had not pursued more aggressively. Aviation officers in particular believed that a carrier commander should have sought the complete destruction of the enemy. The controversy would follow Spruance for the rest of the war and beyond, but those who understood naval warfare at the highest level recognized what Spruance had accomplished. Admiral Ernest King, the chief of naval operations and a notoriously harsh judge of subordinates, told Spruance directly after the battle, "Spruance, you did a damn fine job there. No matter what other people tell you, your decision was correct." Naval historian Samuel Eliot Morison, who would become the official chronicler of the Navy's war, evaluated Spruance's performance in his monumental history of naval operations. "Fletcher did well," Morison wrote, "but Spruance's performance was superb. Calm, collected, decisive, yet receptive to advice, keeping in his mind the picture of widely disparate forces, yet boldly seizing every opening." Raymond. A Spruance emerged from the battle one of the greatest admirals in American naval history. The most telling endorsement came from those who served with Spruance and from an unexpected source. Captain Watanabe Yasuji, who had been on Yamamoto's staff, offered a Japanese perspective after the war. He had an air admiral's best character, Watanabe said of Spruance in his imperfect English. Strong, straight thinker, not impulsive, fluctuating thinker. He aims right at main point and go, no stop. This is good admiral. The contrast with what might have happened could not be starker. Had Spruance pursued westward through the night of June 4, his task force would have encountered Yamamoto's battleships in the early morning hours of June 5. Without the ability to launch aircraft in darkness, his carriers would have been defenseless against ships mounting 14 and 18-inch guns. His cruisers, armed with 8-inch guns and unreliable torpedoes, would have faced Japanese battleships and cruisers superbly trained for exactly this kind of engagement. The likely outcome was catastrophic American losses. The Enterprise and Hornet, representing 2/3 of available American carrier strength in the Pacific, might have been sunk along with their escorts. The victory at Midway might have been transformed into a strategic draw, or even a Japanese success. The course of the Pacific War might have been fundamentally altered. None of this happened because Raymond Spruance trusted his judgment over the advice of his staff and the traditions of his service. Spruance went on to become one of the most successful admirals of the Pacific War. He commanded the Fifth Fleet through the Central Pacific Campaign, directing the assaults on the Gilbert Islands, the Marshall Islands, the Mariana Islands, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. His forces sank more Japanese ships and captured more enemy territory than any other American commander. His approach to command remained consistent throughout the war. He delegated authority to capable subordinates and let them do their jobs. He made decisions based on analysis rather than emotion. He never sought personal glory or newspaper headlines. When reporters asked him about his victories, he deflected credit to his pilots and sailors. When critics questioned his decisions, he declined to defend himself in public. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, Spruance again faced criticism for excessive caution. Rather than pursue the Japanese carrier force aggressively, he prioritized protecting the Saipan invasion force. Aviation officers, led by his carrier commander Mark Mitcher, wanted to steam west through the night to close the distance with the retreating Japanese. Spruance refused. His mission was to support the invasion, not to chase enemy carriers. Critics called it an opportunity missed, but Spruance understood something his critics did not. Intelligence reports indicated the Japanese might attempt an end run around the American fleet to attack the invasion transports. Spruance's defensive posture had prevented this potential disaster while still destroying Japanese naval aviation in what American pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Over 300 Japanese aircraft were shot down in a single day. The Japanese carrier force that Mitcher wanted to chase would never threaten American operations again. Admiral Halsey, who had missed Midway due to illness, provided an inadvertent vindication of Spruance's approach at the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. Halsey pursued a Japanese carrier force aggressively, exactly as Spruance's critics said he should have done at Midway, but the carriers Halsey chased were a decoy. While Halsey pursued them, a powerful Japanese surface force nearly reached the American invasion beaches. Only the heroic sacrifice of destroyers and escort carriers prevented disaster. Quote, Halsey later suggested that it might have been better if he had commanded at the Philippine Sea and Spruance had commanded at Leyte. The lesson of that night in June 1942 extends far beyond naval tactics. It speaks to the nature of leadership under pressure, to the difference between aggression and wisdom, to the courage required to refuse what everyone expects. The 4 carriers lost at Midway were never replaced. Japan lacked the industrial capacity to build new fleet carriers fast enough to matter. The carefully trained air groups that went down with those carriers were equally irreplaceable. In the Solomons campaign that followed Midway, Japanese air power bled away in daily combat over Guadalcanal. By late 1942, the veteran pilots who had attacked Pearl Harbor and swept across the Pacific were mostly dead. Their replacements were rushed into combat with inadequate training. Yamamoto never recovered from Midway. He continued to command the combined fleet for another 10 months, but the initiative had passed to the Americans. In April 1943, American codebreakers intercepted his travel itinerary, just as they had intercepted the Midway operation. Army Air Force's P-38 fighters ambushed his transport aircraft over Bougainville. The architect of Pearl Harbor and Midway was killed, his strategic vision unfulfilled. The Americans grew stronger with every passing month. New carriers slid down the ways of shipyards on both coasts. The Essex-class fleet carriers, designed before the war and now coming into service, were larger, faster, and more capable than anything the Japanese could build. Pilot training programs expanded to produce thousands of new aviators every year. American production capacity, the same industrial power that Hitler had dismissed as propaganda, was burying Japan under an avalanche of ships and aircraft. By 1944, the United States Navy could deploy more aircraft carriers in a single operation than Japan possessed in its entire fleet. The disparity continued to grow. By the time of the Okinawa campaign in 1945, American task forces operated with such overwhelming superiority that Japanese surface ships could barely leave port without being destroyed. The seeds of this transformation were planted at Midway. By preserving his carriers on that June night in 1942, Spruance ensured that the American Pacific Fleet would survive to receive the reinforcements that American industry was preparing to deliver. Had he lost the Enterprise and Hornet in a night surface action, the balance of the Pacific War might have shifted in ways impossible to predict. Hawaii might have been vulnerable. The Guadalcanal campaign might have been delayed or cancelled. The entire trajectory of the Pacific War might have changed. None of this happened because one admiral trusted his judgment on one critical night. Raymond Spruance died in Pebble Beach, California, on December 13, 1969, at the age of 83. He was buried with full military honors at Golden Gate National Cemetery near San Francisco, next to his wife Margaret, and not far from his longtime friend Chester Nimitz. He had never written a memoir. He had never sought publicity. He had served his country quietly and effectively, and when his service was done, he faded from public memory. But the decision he made on the night of June 4, 1942, remains one of the most important command decisions of the Second World War. He chose restraint over aggression, caution over glory, and wisdom over tradition. He turned his ships away from a beaten enemy and sailed towards safety, knowing that some would call him a coward for refusing to pursue. He was not a coward. He was something rarer and more valuable. He was a commander who understood that victory was not measured in ships sunk, but in objectives achieved. He knew that the greatest danger often came not from the enemy, but from one's own success, from the temptation to reach for more when enough had already been won. Yamamoto's trap closed on empty water. The American carriers survived. The Pacific War continued on a trajectory that would end in Tokyo Bay 3 years later. Raymond Spruance sailed east, and history turned with him. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered, and we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans the globe, From veterans to history enthusiasts, you are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive. The decision that Spruance made that night carries lessons that extend far beyond naval warfare. Leaders still face moments when success tempts them to overreach. Commanders still must choose between aggression and prudence. The courage to turn away from glory remains as rare and valuable as it was on that dark Pacific night, when the fate of nations hung on the judgment of a quiet admiral who trusted his instincts over the expectations of others.